One quiet observer begins noticing strange patterns in everyday human behavior, discovering 7 psychology truths that slowly transformed confusion, loneliness, and misunderstanding into deep empathy. The small room was quiet, except for the slow ticking of a round wall clock. Soft afternoon light entered through a narrow window, touching the wooden desk near the corner. Outside, pale gray clouds covered the sky, and a cool breeze moved the leaves of a tall tree standing beside the building. Inside the room sat a quiet observer. The observer often watched people, not in a strange way, not in a judgmental way, just with curiosity. For a long time, people had been confusing. Simple conversations sometimes felt complicated. A friendly smile could suddenly turn distant. Someone could speak kindly but behave coldly minutes later. The observer never understood why. In school halls, in small cafes, on quiet buses, or during evening walks through crowded streets, people always seemed to follow invisible rules nobody explained. The observer remembered sitting in a crowded waiting room one rainy morning. The smell of fresh coffee floated in the air. Raindrops gently tapped against the glass windows. Several people sat on soft gray chairs, quietly scrolling through their phones. A person near the door suddenly laughed loudly while reading a message. Across the room, another person frowned while looking at a similar phone screen. Both were reading something unseen. Both reacted very differently. The observer watched carefully. A small thought appeared. Maybe behavior is not random. Maybe the human mind quietly follows hidden patterns. That idea stayed in the observer's mind for many days. Later that week, while walking through a narrow park path covered with fallen leaves, another moment happened. 2 strangers were sitting on a bench. One person spoke with excited hand movements, smiling brightly. The other simply nodded slowly, barely speaking. Yet somehow the quiet listener seemed more respected in the conversation. The observer noticed something interesting. Sometimes the person who speaks less holds more attention. The breeze moved gently through the trees above. Small understanding began forming. Maybe silence is also a kind of communication. The observer wrote that thought in a small notebook later that evening, page 1. Human behavior is not always about what people say. Days passed, more observations quietly filled the notebook. One afternoon, beside a busy grocery store, another strange moment appeared. A worker accidentally dropped a small box. The sound echoed lightly across the floor. Several people turned to look, but something surprising happened. Nobody reacted until one person helped. The moment a single stranger stepped forward and lifted the box, others quickly joined. The observer blinked slowly. Why did everyone wait? Why did action only begin after someone else started? That night, sitting under a soft yellow lamp in the quiet room, the observer wrote again. Page 2. People often wait for signals from others before acting. The observer leaned back in the chair. Maybe humans are more connected than they appear. Maybe behavior spreads quietly, like ripples in water. The next discovery came during a cloudy evening bus ride. The bus windows reflected dim city lights as it moved slowly through traffic. Inside, passengers sat quietly, each in their own small world. Near the front seat, a tired worker rubbed their eyes. Across the aisle, someone else yawned. Within seconds, 2 more passengers yawned. The observer smiled softly. Yawning had spread through the bus like a silent wave. No words, no signals. Yet the brain copied what it saw. Page 3 in the notebook became simple. Human behavior is contagious. That idea stayed in the observer's thoughts for many days. If emotions spread this easily, maybe kindness spreads too. Maybe calm spreads. Maybe stress spreads. The observer began watching faces more carefully. Expressions, shoulders, eyes, one morning. Sunlight finally returned after several rainy days. Warm light filled the city streets. In a small bakery, people stood in a short line waiting for bread. Near the counter, a person wearing a tired expression quietly paid and left. The worker behind the counter looked exhausted. Then the next customer smiled warmly and thanked the worker. Something small changed. The worker's shoulders relaxed. A faint smile appeared. The observer noticed again. Behavior changes behavior. Kindness creates more kindness. Another page in the notebook slowly filled. Page 4. The brain reflects what it receives. Weeks passed. The observer's notebook grew thicker, but something else also grew: confusion. Because the more the observer understood behavior patterns, the more complicated emotions seemed. One evening, the sky turned deep orange as the sun slowly disappeared behind tall buildings. The observer sat on a quiet park bench. A group of friends walked past, laughing loudly. But one person in the group stayed quiet, smiling, yet distant. The observer recognized that smile. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind people use when they do not want others to worry. A protective smile. The observer looked down at the notebook again. Page 5. People hide feelings behind behavior. A long breath left the observer's chest. Understanding people was not becoming easier. It was becoming deeper, heavier, because every pattern revealed something fragile inside human behavior. Fear, loneliness, hope. The observer suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Many behaviors that once seemed rude, strange, or confusing might actually be quiet signals of something deeper. Maybe impatience hides anxiety. Maybe silence hides insecurity. Maybe anger hides fear. The cool evening wind moved softly through the park trees. Leaves rustled quietly. The observer closed the notebook slowly. 5 truths were already written. But something inside felt unfinished. Right. Because noticing patterns was only the beginning. Understanding them would require something harder: patience, empathy, and the courage to see people beyond their actions. The observer looked around the park. People walked by, some laughing, some quiet, some lost in thought. For the first time, the observer did not feel confused watching them. Instead, there was a strange feeling growing slowly: curiosity mixed with compassion. Human behavior was not random. It was a language, a quiet language the mind speaks through actions, expressions, and small choices. And perhaps there were still 2 more truths waiting to be discovered. The observer stood up from the bench as the evening sky slowly darkened. Soft streetlights flickered on one by one. The notebook rested quietly in the observer's hand. Tomorrow, more patterns would appear, or small moments. More hidden signals of the human mind. And slowly, piece by piece, the quiet observer would begin seeing people in a completely different way. The evening air was cool when the quiet observer walked home from the park. Streetlights glowed softly along the empty sidewalk. Cars moved slowly in the distance, their lights stretching like thin golden lines across the dark road. The small notebook rested in the observer's hand, slightly warm from being held for so long. 5 truths were already written inside. But the observer felt something important was still missing. Understanding people was not only about noticing patterns. It was about seeing what those patterns meant. The observer opened the notebook again while walking slowly beneath the dim streetlights. The pages moved gently in the wind. The street was calm, almost silent. Only the quiet hum of distant traffic and the soft sound of footsteps filled the night. The observer paused near a small corner cafe that was closing for the day. Inside, a worker wiped the last table while another stacked chairs carefully. The observer stood outside the window for a moment. Watching something small happened inside. One worker accidentally dropped a spoon. The metal sound lightly echoed across the room. The worker looked tired and a little embarrassed, but the other worker simply smiled and said something kind. The embarrassed worker laughed softly, and the tension in the room disappeared. The observer felt another quiet realization forming. Small reactions changed the emotional direction of a moment. The observer quickly wrote inside the notebook, page 6. The brain searches for emotional safety. People react strongly when they feel judged, ignored, or misunderstood. But when someone offers calm or kindness, the brain relaxes. The observer closed the notebook slowly. It explained many past moments. Arguments that grew larger than necessary. Awkward conversations that suddenly felt uncomfortable. Cold reactions that appeared for no clear reason. Many times people were not reacting to words. They were reacting to how safe they felt. The observer continued walking. A gentle wind moved through the quiet street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Further ahead, a small bus stop stood beneath a tall streetlight. A few people waited quietly on the bench. The observer sat at the far end of the bench. Watching the scene without speaking, a young person looked nervous, tapping their foot repeatedly. Another person checked the time again and again, An older person sat calmly, simply watching the empty road. The observer noticed something interesting. Everyone was feeling something different, but no one spoke about it. Yet their bodies revealed everything. The nervous foot tapping, the restless glances, the calm breathing. The observer understood something deeper. Human behavior speaks even when people stay silent. The observer opened the notebook again. Page 7. The mind reveals. Emotions through behavior long before words appear. For a long moment, the observer stared at the page. 7 truths now filled the notebook. But instead of feeling satisfied, the observer felt something unexpected. A quiet warmth, because suddenly many confusing moments from the past made sense. The observer remembered times when someone seemed rude for no reason. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Times when someone stayed distant during friendly conversations. Maybe they were protecting themselves. Times when silence felt uncomfortable. Maybe the other person was simply afraid of saying the wrong thing. The observer slowly looked around the bus stop again. Now the scene looked different. Not strange. Not confusing, human. The bus arrived quietly, its headlights cutting through the dim streetlight glow. The doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, and the waiting passengers stepped inside, one by one. The observer sat near the window. As the bus moved through the quiet streets, reflections of city lights passed across the glass like moving stars. The observer thought about the 7 truths written in the notebook. Human behavior follows patterns. People wait for signals from others. Emotions spread quietly between minds. Kindness reflects back through behavior. People hide feelings behind actions. The brain searches for emotional safety. And behavior reveals emotions before words appear. For the first time, the observer realized something powerful. Understanding behavior was never about controlling people. It was about understanding invisible struggles. The observer watched the passengers inside the bus. One person leaned their head against the window, looking exhausted after a long day. Another quietly read messages on their phone, smiling slightly. 2 strangers shared a brief, polite nod before looking away again. Small human moments filled the quiet bus. Before, these moments felt confusing. Now they felt meaningful. Each person carried thoughts no one else could see. Each person had worries, hopes, memories, and fears quietly shaping their behavior. The observer suddenly felt something unexpected growing inside. Empathy. Not the heavy feeling of sadness, but a calm understanding. People were not difficult. People were simply complicated inside, and most of the time, their behavior was the only language their minds knew how to speak. The bus slowed as it approached. The observers stopped. Outside, the neighborhood streets were peaceful. Soft porch lights glowed beside quiet houses, and a cool night breeze moved gently through nearby trees. The observer stepped off the bus and began the short walk home. For the first time in a long while, watching people no longer felt confusing or lonely. Instead, it felt like reading a quiet story written through small actions. A tired smile, a patient pause, a nervous laugh. Each behavior carried meaning. The observer reached the small building where the quiet room waited upstairs. Inside the room, the same wooden desk stood beside the window. The round wall clock continued its slow ticking. The observer placed the notebook carefully on the desk and opened it again. 7 pages, 7 truths. But something else had changed. The observer no longer felt like someone standing outside the world, watching from a distance. Instead, the observer felt connected to the quiet, emotional patterns that move through every human life. Because everyone carries invisible thoughts. Everyone hides certain fears. Everyone searches for understanding. And sometimes the kindest thing one mind can offer another mind is patience. The observer gently closed the notebook. Outside the window, the tall tree moved softly in the night breeze. For a moment, the observer imagined something simple. What if more people understood these quiet patterns of the mind? What if more people paused before judging someone's behavior? What if people looked for hidden emotions instead of only visible actions? The world might feel a little calmer, a little kinder, a little more human. The observer smiled quietly, because the greatest discovery inside the notebook was not about psychology. It was about compassion. Understanding the mind helps us understand each other. And sometimes the smallest moment of understanding can change an entire